Welcome all. Thanks to everybody who are joining us live stream tonight. We'd like to welcome you to this Open House Hobart event and to thank Lysart, who's sponsored this evening, Learning from Barry McNeill. My name's Nikki Adams and I've been on the Open House Hobart committee for a number of years on and off. And we talk about Barry most years and we've always been keen to acknowledge him. Tonight we'd like to celebrate Barry's significant contribution to the architectural profession and community, but specifically his role as a memorable educator and mentor. Tomorrow marks the anniversary of his passing, the 12th of the 11th, 2014. His generosity of spirit and commitment to education shaped and informed the careers of many architects. Barry was responsible for founding the first environmental design course in Australia and was interested in experimenting with the norms of education and inviting discourse and student interaction. He was passionate about the individual spirit and encouraged students to understand their point of difference. The family acknowledged that his passion as a social scientist, educator and creator was keenly observed and perhaps influenced Mary's career as a planner, Ruth's as a doctor, and Jane's first as a ceramicist and then an architect. I was a student of Barry McNeill's in the early 90s at the Hobart Jam Factory. Then he was a sessional tutor, and I wasn't aware of his significant role in forming the foundations with others of the architectural education I was about to embark on. At that time, he strongly directed a particular presentation technique, a pencil drawing on detail paper style, and taught this method so the image would have a long life and be legible as a printed die-line drawing, even when used for contract documentation. From this exercise, I came to understand him as a meticulous architect. He shared his own personal design process, where the construction methodology always informed the design principles. I find myself returning to this regularly in practice. He was an intuitive teacher, watching and observing an individual, and many who have spoken to me over the last few weeks and months remember fondly how, as a mentor, he was able to flip the idiom of a personal weakness into a strength. The first time I met Barry, he was running a subject called Tasmanian architecture. He said something like, "Too commonly people know very little of the history and culture of the place in which they live and have not considered how it has informed their consciousness. Australians and architecture students perhaps know even less about the development of Tasmania's cultural heritage and the social and human factors that informed and shaped our island. So for this subject, I want you to devise your own program. Research something you don't know about and come back at the end of the semester and teach us what you've learned." So off I went with two of my closest friends each Thursday on a road trip up the East Coast, visiting remote historic properties, looking for signs of and mapping the outbuildings that had housed and contained convicts who were available to the property owners at the time. Of particular interest to us were structures built by the convicts employing materials and methods suitable to remote situations. I'm not convinced that we uncovered anything that people might not have already known, but we felt like pioneers, and it took us to some stunning locations, as well as some rather devastatingly derelict buildings. On one occasion, arriving unannounced, as architecture students did at that time, we were met by a gruff and angry man with his shotgun. I tell this story as an example of a teaching technique set in place during the formation of the original environmental design course, employing a simple but radical technique at the time called learning by making or doing. Our speakers for tonight are Lee Woolley, Prue Slatcher and Bevin Reese. All of them were students, I think, in some form of Barry's. Lee Woolley is the first speaker tonight and has 30 years of professional experience as an architectural and urban design practitioner, author and educator. Lee was 16 when he first met Barry, and Barry suggested architecture as a suitable career path. That meeting was to set in course Lee's education, but importantly, a lifelong friendship. Lee, thanks.
Thanks, Nikki. I was asked to provide an overview of Barry's educational and practice life, but it's not something that can adequately be covered in an evening's event, let alone a conference. That can't begin to really do justice to his work. But for the moment, I'll attempt to very briefly provide some infill. Necessarily, this is chronological, not thematic. In a citation I wrote about Barry for the Australian Encyclopedia of Architecture in 2012, I stated that he was, quote, the most influential Tasmanian architect and planner of the second half of the 20th century. Having pioneered reforms in tertiary education from the late 1960s as an educator and commentator, his influence is nationally significant. That's become even more so. I first met Barry 50 years ago when I was a matriculation student and he was head of the School of Architecture and Town Planning at the Hobart Technical College. He was also changing that into the new Department of Environmental Design within the soon-to-be completed Tasmanian College of Advanced Education. Unbeknownst to me at that initial meeting was that he was radically engineering this educational framework within the nation, transforming the teaching program into a problem-solving based learning by doing model where students were expected to establish their own learning aims. Nonetheless, I was drawn in by his forthright enthusiasm and also his encouragement at an individual level. The upcoming orientation early in 1971, that was in 1970, included students being deposited on the less than accommodating at that time Maria Island without staff to see how, as an orientation group, they would get on with one another and the environment. This was real Lord of the Flies stuff. It was the early 1970s, of course. Of course, it became a metaphor for the need to consider one's own comfort zone and indeed the role of shelter in that process. Also, the need to communicate with one another led me certainly to developing a magazine within the department with others, and also testing whether we could walk on water. It didn't work, particularly when we were trying to get down to Constitution Dock, but unfortunately on the way Rob Barclay had to demand to be cut out of the plastic chrysalis for lack of air. But pneumatics were early on in that stage of architectural experimentation. The brilliant brutalist building of the RMC at the TCAE at Mount Nelson, in fact, was counterposed by the stark interior of the adjacent engineering building, where the department was located by 1972. The enormous energy that Barry put in to establish and run the program, allay the doubters, build staff numbers across different disciplines, and keep students coming, which they did, from across the country, impressed me. It was a brilliant program, and conceptually still is. The second half of the 1970s, we've got to remember this is the pre-computer age, meant that the department information exchange, i.e. was a manually generated matching of resources and skills to share topics and research within a geographically diverse departmental membership. And this was represented in a variety of different ways, but also by something that became a national network of basically environmental activism, largely through Jeremy Dawkins, but grounded through the department, which actually, pre-computers, were linking people in diverse aspects of their education and their activism and interests nationally. Unfortunately for the school, the flowering of the TCAE in the early 1970s proved too successful. And the subsequent restructuring of advanced education from the mid-1970s, and this was occurring nationally, but it was occurring first in Tasmania, meant that the writing was on the wall for ED in Hobart, with significant concern that the teaching model that accessed many practicing architects locally could not be sustained if it was transmigrated at that time, and was the case to Launceston. So a lot of energy was poured into sustaining and running and keeping the course. But in spite of that, or in spite of the politics of tertiary education during this time, not only was the program an enduring outcome, but there were many other enduring outcomes. The Special Visitors Program, that included, in this instance, Richard Laplastria, being invited by Barry, initially as a visitor, has given rise to sustained friendship, and with it a deepening appreciation of the place of architecture for many of us through his learning and his generosity. Not only did Barry have the foresight to invite Rick to Tasmania, but he initiated and then resourced the concept of a small prototypical timber building to showcase and value add the potential of Tasmanian timber. And at the time, we must remember that the forests of Tasmania were being rapaciously logged and chipped. And Rick brilliantly rose to the challenge, assisted by a group of students open to an education through him and the immersion of actually building the building designed and built as the Wombat, then became a meeting space for many events thereafter. I know Barry considered this one of the most important legacies of the school, and it's certainly a place that many of us still enjoy and love. With the dismantling of the Advanced College and the non-negotiable relocation of the School of Environmental Design and Architecture to Launceston, Barry resigned as head, and together with other kindred spirits established the Hobart Architectural Cooperative in 1980. Here we are on the steps of the Lady Franklin Museum in Lena Valley, and here we are in Adrian Fitzgerald's brilliant interpretation of the Hobart grid. The co-op arrives to its resting place in the dockside offices next to Constitution Dock. Here it was to be an urban studies centre, an alternative school of architecture, and a location for exhibitions, conferences, events, with a membership that was national, international, and local. The diversity of activities that occurred over this period of 4 years or so, 4 or 5 years, is quite extraordinary. I mean, my files are inadequately archived, but it's extraordinary the amount of stuff we put on. There were weekly lectures, quarterly design conferences, annual members exhibitions, a range of other activities. The exhibitions were diverse, such as the Jackson and Cox seminars looking at both North Hobart and Sullivan's Cove, the history of the Tasmanian trading catches, with a gentleman making half models within the exhibition. Extraordinary stuff, great stuff. And always a shared meal and a cohesive discourse giving rise to what continued as an important, not only centre, place of education, but friendship group. At the same time as the co-op, Barry established his own practice, initially operating from the co-op. How did he do that? The building that most exemplifies this period to me of his work is the Calvin Christian Primary School at Kingston. Unfortunately, he asked me to go to photograph it. I think it has an enduring influence in Tasmanian architecture. There's a rigorous adherence to the manufactured dimension of materials, a rationalist approach to construction. Glass is bedded or beaded directly into the post and beam structure. There's a use of sustainable materials, compact dimensions, multi-purpose spaces, no corridors, and an extraordinarily humane place to learn. Going back to these images, it continues to inform me, which is terrific, of what good architecture is. The co-op continued, although not in the dockside offices, the lease was up, had run out, but a regionalism and localism conference brought together practitioners and others from around the country. We were consciously confronting the parochialism of the Melbourne-Sydney architectural axis and trying to think of what is really the architecture of diversity within the nation. And this brought together some great architects from different locations around the nation, but also others, such as our then Poet Laureate, Les Murray. And this wonderful, I think it also combined members exhibition at the time. Then, as his workload grew, and with the lease on the co-op not renewed, he expanded his practice studio at 303A Mount Nelson Road. Pat grimacing there. To accommodate an ever-expanding group of assistants. Many of the current generation of practitioners have benefited from being part of what we fondly remember as the Barry McNeill Finishing School. Craig, Jim, Jonathan, Greg and many others are beneficiaries of this period. And of course, learning also from Barry's architecture whilst working within it. But the project for me that most exemplifies that time was the Caldwell Primary School in Canberra. Barry was already a member of the National Building Committee of the Schools Commission, sat on the National Planning Committee and the ACT Design and Siting Review Committee, but this project took his strategic educational values to Canberra in built form. It won an ACT Chapter Merit Award, as did his housing projects in Canberra soon thereafter. And of course, no visit to Canberra happened without an immersion into the local architecture and trying to appreciate it, including work done in this instance by Rex Addison, one of the invitees to the Regionalism and Localism conference. Other civic projects, such as the Alona Community Hall were equally well received and provided a venue also for weekends away, which were continuing a tradition of immersion in the Tasmanian landscape, but also opportunities to actually embrace the culture of the place and bring in others who were serious about a consideration of that. I think, Bevin, this was our first offshore conference, wasn't it? I think national... The first. I think nationally, the Institute did a conference in Singapore, so we thought we'd do as their first offshore conference. So we thought we'd do the first Tasmanian offshore conference on Bruni. Anyway. Meanwhile, from locally sourced pine, Barry began himself building the family shack and retreat at Nebraska Beach, North Bruni. The boat shed, which I've always admired, I think doubles as an Antipodean tea house, more so than a boat shed, but it serves both purposes nonetheless, and identifies the compound of buildings from nearby. The same sustainable values and truth to materials identifying the buildings. Barry designed a number of houses, many that won state awards. And I'm not sure if this one was ever entered for an award, but I've always admired the Douglas House in Goulburn Street for the way it unapologetically negotiates a narrow lot to become part of the layered neighbourhood. Barry's control of the domestic scale, its proportions and material palette is well in evidence. Meanwhile, Barry was also practising as an urban planner. As part of the Central Area Study Project from the early 1990s, some of us had been commissioned to provide topic reports on a number of themes. It was Barry, however, who was engaged to amalgamate these into the amenity provisions that have since formed part of the interim planning scheme. He also assisted council in their, and these are evident, you know, this becomes that, that's in the scheme, but it's pulling together a whole lot of other considerations. He also assisted council in their upgrading of the Wapping precinct, and although his conceptual approach to reveal the rerouted rivulet course was never realised, his thinking is still in evidence in the pattern in the paving, the Greek symbol for water. So architecture's long, urban design's really long, but planning the city right is an even longer game. The references are all important and we need to keep going back to them. For a decade, from the late 1980s until his retirement in 1997, Barry was coordinating a column in the Mercury newspaper, Oriel. Writing most of the articles himself, it was a weekly update on planning and design, demystifying an otherwise complex subject for the general public, while also expanding public awareness of the place and role of design. It's now sorely missed. We should do something about that. Following his retirement, he began writing a book on the 20th century in Tasmania, its architecture and planning. As members of the then 20th Century Committee of the Institute, subsequently the sort of Heritage Committee, we were increasingly concerned that some of the best work of the 20th century could be lost before it was adequately appreciated. With two LWs in support, Linda Warner, graphic designer, and Lee Woolley, photographer, the book was published in 2002. It received a National Award for Planning Scholarship and Research in 2003. Barry continued his professional commitment to the state long into retirement, being an invaluable panel member of the Tasmanian Resource Management and Planning Appeals Tribunal from 2004. He also continued to document and research Tasmanian architects. He's the only Tasmanian to be honoured as a Life Fellow of the Royal Australian Institute of Architects and the Planning Institute of Australia. And I very much doubt whether there will be any other person that will fit that role. The Wombat has continued as a meeting space over the years, as have the weekends away. Barry often said, we all stand on the shoulders of others. And in that, I wholly concur. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. In introducing our next speaker, I thought that I'd quote from Barry himself. The times were important, and in a talk that the family provided for me in 2010 to the Tasmanian Heritage Society, was it? Yeah. Barry said himself, I spent 1968 to 1969 in the United States at MITS at a particularly momentous time. The Vietnam War, presidential elections, Apollo 8, urban riots, Bobby Kennedy assassination, university turmoil, educational debate. How fortuitous to be setting up a school with this backdrop. Prue Slater, now a landscape architect in Hobart, was enrolled as an architecture student at the University of Sydney. When I asked her to speak, I asked her what drew her to the course. She was hitchhiking in 1971 around Tasmania and caught a lift with a graduate architect, Bob Vincent, then a fifth-year student, and he told her about the course. She met with Barry and was really inspired by the radical approach to the course and left Sydney and moved her life down here. Prue, over to you.
Okay, I've chosen to talk about the Hobart Architectural Cooperative for two reasons. Firstly, I think its activities and the way it operated was an expression of many of Barry's values. And secondly, because it was unique in Australia. It was part architecture club, part practice, and part independent architecture school, and had some similarities with the Architectural Association in London. With the government closing the colleges of advanced education, only a decade after they began, Barry resigned as head of school, realising the Department of Environmental Design would not be able to continue in its current form within the constraints of a university. Barry, passionate about education, collegiality, the pursuit of new ideas, and discourse about space and place, gathered a group of recent graduates, architects, and related practitioners to establish the Hobart Architectural Cooperative. The co-op was located in Dockside offices, a two-storey building now demolished, but once existing on the site of Mawson's Pavilion beside Constitution Dock. Jaws occupied the first floor and rented out a substantial space to the co-op. Jamison Allam was RAI president at the time. A small group attended the co-op on a daily basis, working on co-op projects and research, organising events and co-op administration. Barry ran his newly established architectural practice from the same space, and most of this small group also worked for Barry. I was one of this group, and looking back, I'm amazed at what we achieved, like Lee. We carried out projects, organised seminars, workshops, conferences, and every week there was Friday drinks with a speaker. Through the co-op and his co-located practice, Barry was teacher, mentor, employer, and friend to us all. The poster, which you can see here and on the wall there, Regular bulletins and flyers for specific events communicated details of our activities in the days before email and internet. Articles in Architecture Australia generated a lot of interest and letters of support from all over the country. I'm not sure of exact numbers, but I think there were between 50 and 100 members of the co-op. Was it?
I think it was more.
More. Mm.
Across the nation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The projects the co-op carried out had a number of purposes. They provided employment and funds, and they were a vehicle for learning by doing in the co-op's School of Architecture. Barry was a strong believer in apprenticeship and learning by doing, and these values were the core of education at the co-op. Admittedly, whilst I was involved, we only had one student. The prospectus, which outlined the approach to education at the co-op and generated huge interest from existing dissatisfied and potential new architecture students, didn't actually result in any increased student numbers at the co-op. But one of the earliest projects we did was the City Access, and this was for the Hobart City Council, and it involved intensive and extensive community engagement with people with varying disabilities, an analysis of the problem areas within the CBD, and recommendations to improve access. Team members accompanied people with disabilities, learning about their problems, and we also got out and about ourselves in wheelchairs and wearing goggles to simulate visual impairment. Nikki reminded me that I used this methodology later in my own teaching, and here's Barry truly embracing learning by doing. Another project on the yellow page was the Midway Point Neighbourhood Centre, designed by a co-op member, Martin Butcher. And this was built by the local community of mud bricks, which they made themselves over a period of 2 months. I don't think occupational health and safety would allow us to do anything like that anymore. Other projects included the interior design for the Tasmanian Environment Centre, design of some huts at the site of first European settlement of Hobart, which demonstrated early building techniques, an entry in the Newcastle Foreshore Design Competition, research into 20th century Hobart architecture in collaboration with the RAIA, and the Calvin Christian School at Kingston within Barry's practice. Barry had strong ideas, often radical, but he was never aggressive or domineering in expecting others to accept them. He also believed in delegation of responsibility and rarely told us what to do or how to do things. He had a gentle but powerful way of persuading us to follow his ideas. I remember him looking at a detail I'd done for Calvin School, and when I asked if it was wrong and should be redesigned, his reply was, "No, but I would never have done it that way." This photo shows him working on convincing Jim Jones about one of his ideas. The body language says it all. Advocacy. Advocacy was seen as a very important way of increasing community awareness and debate about our physical environment. Conservation of our built and natural heritage was a focal issue at the co-op, and comments on numerous undesirable development proposals were developed and publicised through the Mercury newspaper. Heritage legislation and appeal processes in those days were very basic and undefined. So as well as commenting on proposed developments, the co-op always developed alternative designs, which was pretty amazing. Commenting on the Wellington Park Management Plan in 1982, the co-op offered to get straight to work on visual assessment, ideas for the Springs site, and plans for an urban trail from Franklin Square to the pinnacle of Mount Wellington. This is actually something that Council is considering now, 30 years later. Correspondence between the co-op and the Minister for Heritage shows strong agreement for the need for stronger heritage legislation, with the Minister actually asking the co-op for suggestions and recommendations. The slide shows the co-op's alternative to the proposed demolition and redevelopment of 2 buildings in Elizabeth Street for the Bank of New South Wales. Note that the proposal extends beyond the building with connections through the block. And I think this was another thing about Barry's ideas about architecture, you know, it was never constricted just to a building. It was always the context and the broader environment as well. Conferences and workshops and public lectures. Conferences were held once or twice a year, and they always, but Lee, you said they were quarterly.
There was an intention to have a quarterly event. Sometimes
yeah.
That was a
Conference.
you know, a mini conference like this,
Yeah.
or a design workshop.
Yeah. Conferences were held, well, on a regular basis and always involved a public lecture. The format was workshop rather than presentation, so that participants were able to engage directly with the conference leaders on a design project, practicing learning by doing. The first conference was with Darryl Jackson and Philip Cox, eminent Australian architects at the time, who had such respect for Barry that they were happy to give up their time and spend a weekend at the Co-op. Other early conferences were with Bruce Goodsir from Queensland then at the time, and Howard Raggart from Melbourne, both inspiring young architects at the time. Professor David Saunders from the University of Adelaide School of Architecture and Professor Max Charlesworth from Deakin University's School of Philosophy ran a 2-day workshop in 1983 called Conservatism, the City and Architecture. And I think it's interesting that, you know, the Professor of Architecture from the University of Adelaide is interested in coming to the Co-op to run a workshop. The first of the Co-op's visiting fellows was Laurie Wilson, a planning consultant and deputy chair of the National Trust in Victoria, speaking on conservation legislation and running workshops on the future of Hobart. Barry was known and respected by architects and related professionals throughout Australia and overseas, as demonstrated by the range of interesting visiting professionals who were willing to give seminars, workshops and public lectures. The Co-op held a number of exhibitions. The first one was the members' exhibition, and members were asked to provide any creative outputs. And this was very effective in demonstrating the diversity of creative skill amongst our members. There's a list there, I don't know whether you can read it, of the contributors to the first members' exhibition. Early on, there was also the Lost Hobart exhibition, which was an exhibition of original drawings of buildings which were either never built or had been demolished or had been significantly altered. There was also the Hobart Architecture 1900 to 1945 exhibition, which was a photographic exhibition of significant 20th century Hobart buildings. And this was connected to the research being done by the Co-op, identifying significant 20th century buildings for the Register of the National Estate and the RAIA's preparation of a city guide. This work was perhaps later to inspire Barry's book, Architecture from the Edge. And this fabulous photo by Lee was taken from the roof of the Marienbold building. Probably something else you couldn't do today.
And hand-tinted sepia tone. No Photoshop here.
And another exhibition that Lee has mentioned was the evolution of the Hobart trading ketch. But the Friday drinks and talks was the most regular and popular Co-op activity. The Co-op was the place to go for Friday drinks, and there's a young Barry Shelton in that photo. Every Friday, the Co-op put on drinks, nibbles, and a speaker. Speakers came from diverse backgrounds, but were always creatives or involved in space or place. A few of the flyers here demonstrate this. There's Barry's 5 special seminars on meaning in Japanese landscape and architecture, Ray Tickner's The Cooperative Housing Movement, a film screening of the Franklin River blockade, Fred Condon, an owner-builder enthusiast from California, and Paul Shepard, Professor of Natural Philosophy and Human Ecology, also from California. Sometimes a meal was included. I remember cooking up big pots of bouillabaisse for seafood meals. By 1985, Barry was considering the future of the co-op, given the changes since its establishment 5 years earlier. He wrote, "Most of the initial establishing group, being young, mobile and talented, have left Hobart to pursue their lives and interests, and no new young people have been joining to take their place. He felt that the current conservative social climate was not conducive to young people pursuing ideals and making adventurous and courageous decisions. He proposed a realistic but rather sad strategy of reducing the premises to save costs. By 1987, the co-op had rescinded its status as an incorporation and was operating more as a club, an architecture club, out of the Tasmanian Environment Centre. However, the ideals lived on, and the co-op continued to collaborate with the RAIA, UTAS and other organisations to organise forums for the discussion of important architectural and environmental issues. And these are some of the, that one, Millstone to Touchstone was actually in 1999. And then there's a talk by Craig Roseveare, Grant Calder and Tim Penny, Understanding and Designing in a Historical Context and Ecological Horticulture. So through the co-op, I think Barry demonstrated his enthusiasm for lifelong learning and his courage and confidence in establishing a new direction for architectural education. His radical and innovative thinking, his commitment to and achievements in promoting environmentally and socially responsible design and planning outcomes, and his love of collegiality and generosity in sharing his knowledge and ideas. Thank you.
Our third speaker for tonight is Bevin Reese. He's been practicing architecture for 50 years and he said he doesn't actually need a formal introduction, so with great fondness, Bevin. Yeah.
It's wonderful how you, when your mind's forced to put it to a task, and I suddenly realised out of this process that how critically Barry suddenly slots into this whole timescale where all of a sudden he moved out of the co-op and the school and moved into private practice, and he moved into working with the Institute, and a whole spate of things happened in the next 10 or 15 years, which I think are uncannily related to Barry. I first knew Barry in 1962, I think it was. Strangely, he only ever taught me town planning theory. Of course, he's actually been teaching me about everything else for the next 50 years, but that really is the value of the man. He taught me town planning. I think I came to realise in that context that town planning is not about a conceptualised idea, it's about manipulating and handling a process. Barry was heavily involved with the Institute in those early days. Here we see Barry, Jim Moon, Dirk Bolt, and the Venerable Sid Blythe, the head of the architecture school at the time. Barry was incredibly involved in the Institute, not just then, but right through the whole of his life. He held various positions in the Institute, ranging from President, National Secretary and beyond, but always through his whole career maintained this incredible enthusiasm towards the importance of contributing to the profession. I think it was a key, what I suddenly think was a really key point in my involvement with Barry. In 1988, at the time, Barry was the president of the Institute, and it was the Institute's annual dinner at the Green Room in Recipe Point, and Barry encouraged Lee Woolley and Tim Penny and myself to put together what he later described as an urban design theoretical, commenting on the civic square of the time. And actually I think this was a significant point, because Barry then was encouraging this notion that there is more to architecture than architecture. And he was encouraging that we've got to expand, and if we're going to have events and whatnot, we've got to involve ourselves in a process of enjoyment. And I think Barry was a key player in that role. You know, he loved all sorts of things, and he encouraged all sorts of things. And once again, in the year of his presidency, we had cricket matches. I think there were about 2 or 3. We also had an Institute basketball team. But
Kesselman, eat your heart out.
where am I? But if Barry was here now, he'd like me to move on and think about perhaps other things, and we'll move now to the wonderful McNeill Holiday House at Nebraska Beach, and I think it's appropriate to just read from the citation that we've put forward to the National Register in relation to this project. The citation includes that this project is a material expression of Barry's design philosophy in its approach to the use of materials, the building systems employed, and site planning and its owner-built construction. It's an expression of learning by doing. The complex is significant as an example of regional Tasmanian approach where individual buildings elements are configured to create protected external spaces through the building's timber post and beam construction, and through the landform responses where buildings step within the site while re-entering the views. Of course, we're on Bruny, so we can proceed to the Bruny Island Community Centre, which in the year of Barry's presidency received the Prime Award from the Institute. It was at this building that the first international offshore conference was ever staged. And this was a very important conference in that through Barry's encouragement, there was a focus developed where, in terms of what we're doing, we should look at ourselves as the major resource of energy. And we shouldn't be looking for conferences where we invite overseas speakers, because we don't have to go there. In the context of the Bruny conference, Barry personally arranged for the renowned poet Gwen Harwood to participate. He also arranged for the composer Don Kay. Through the ABC, that we experienced at the conference the world premiere of Don Kay's Spirit of 1E, symphonic work Spirit of 1E, not by electronic media, but by virtue of the ABC through our car radios sitting outside on the beach. And this conference was always very important. But Neil sitting up the back there will realise one of the wonderful contributions to the conference was Roger Brett Jennings' discourse on section 52.A and the rule of the sea and its application to the section of to the matter of sexual assault on the footpath of the footpath outside the Hobart Post Office. And also Prince Charles came along through the auspices of Andrew Conscience, and the red carpet was rolled out to take the mickey out of him. From the first offshore conference on Bruni emanated the movement towards the emergence of the Tasmanian architectural narratives energy and the emergence of the conferences at Cranbrook. Cranbrook started in 1998 and proceeded through to 2004 and again then to 2007. And here's Barry standing on the right. This is at the time of the demise of the architectural school as we knew it, and Barry's resignation. I assure you that is Barry on the right hand side there. Ironically, Lee has a slide identical taken from the other side.
I thought, oh no, it couldn't be that blurry.
During the same time, around 88 and the presidency of Barry, the other architects' alternative annual dinner movement emerged. It was kind of aimed about taking the mickey out of the relevance of architectural awards, and I guess taking the mickey out of some of the people who are doing really dreadful things. So it was an invited event, and it used to occur in such places as what we used to call the Chan International Chinese Restaurant in Liverpool Street. At those events, we move now to what really is an important, I think a really important factor, that Barry wasn't meant to be an architect. He was a frustrated vaudeville performer, and that was his real love in the situation. Here it was reported that he was at one of our events that he was Barry McNeill, but he wasn't. He didn't ever sing "I Want to Be Loved by You." He could have readapted it, but certainly on that occasion I recall that he gave a rendition of what's known as of a song called "That's Architecture," based on "That's Entertainment" by the famous Arthur Schwartz and Errol Dieter of 1932. We subsequently had a production at the Globe Theatre in Davies Street. You know the Globe Theatre in Davies Street. Barry did a wonderful rendition of Irving Berlin's "Putting on the Kitsch." And perhaps his primary performance was Cole Porter's Brush Up Your Bannister Fletcher, which was performed at the Theatre Royal in conjunction with the 1994 National Architectural Conference, where we staged what was called at last the Bannister Fletcher Show, and Barry and I was privileged to appear in a duo soft shoe shuffle with Barry on that occasion on not Irving Berlin, Cole Porter's a ditty on Cole Porter's well-known song. I think out of this, we've got to have the Barry McNeill songbook worked out somewhere. I've got all the words of the stuff, but I've got about 5 or 6 songs that Barry put together, they really have to come out there into the public somehow. We'll work on that one.
Bevin, I do play the music, but I haven't got those special words.
Haven't you?
No.
You've only got the originals. You've only got Fred Astaire and what that. But I think at this stage, I think Barry would like to take us back to Bruni, and he wants to take us back to Bruni, and I'd just like to touch on what I think of his 2 most memorable works. One is the shack at Binalong Bay, which is a wonderful building in the same vernacular as his Dens Point and Alonna buildings. And also, I think for me the other gem of his work is the Calvin Christian School, which Leah's touched on earlier. Now, in the 2003, whenever you were doing the book, what was that?
2000, it was published in 2002.
Yeah, 2000. In around 2000, Barry rang me up one day, and he said, "You know that house you did in 1960 in Sandy Bay?" He said, "I recall." He said, "I recall you had a drawing of it. Can you give me a copy?" And I said, "Oh, what do you want it for?" And he said, "Oh, well, I'd rather like to produce it in the book." And so I was highly privileged that I think there are only 2 drawings in the book, and I was highly privileged that one of my drawings should be one of them. So in closing, I owe a huge amount to Barry McNeill. He was a close friend and a colleague, and thanks, Barry.
Thanks, Bevin. That was very entertaining. We've got 2 sort of events happening tonight. So the live stream, I'm going to say some thank yous and sign off, and then invite a bit of a panel discussion. But before we do, we'd like to thank everyone who's attended tonight, everyone on the live stream, not that we know who's there, all of those who've spoken tonight and given very generously of their time. Lysite for the sponsoring the event. To Open House Hobart sponsors City Hobart, Tasmanian Government, City Hobart. Fatago, who are graphic designers. Access Solutions, Austral Bricks. And importantly, the girls at the Institute who work very hard and thoughtfully, always in the background. So in thanking everyone, importantly, I'd like to thank Mary and Pat McNeill, Chris Harmon, Jonathan Pyefinch, Kerrigan Owen, Jim Jones, Dave Travalia, Lee Woolley, Bevin, Prue, and Genevieve Lilly, for all of you, for the several conversations you've had with me whilst we've been pulling together the event. It seems like from all the stories there'll be many more people that we could have spoken with. But I'd like to include this speaker series by summarising with some of your own words that Barry was an ethical practitioner, a great facilitator, and above all, a true gentleman. Jonathan Pyefinch unfortunately couldn't be here tonight and has been described by some with his business partner, Greg Luttrell, as the Roy and HG of the Hobart architecture scene. So tune in for an event where they appear next time. Jonathan was one of Barry's longest employees. I think that's correct, isn't it? And he said the main word would be grateful, that Barry had informed his moral and spiritual compass. And he sent me an email yesterday saying, Barry would say thank you when I left the office. Not sure that it was every day, but it was often enough and always struck me as an interesting custom. I reflected on that more recently, and it struck me as such a small acknowledgement, but one that mattered to me. The appreciation, I think, understood that work life is often routine and invariably mundane. However, these small gratitudes are humane and so important to our well-being. After spending an evening with Pat McNeill and Mary McNeill, Pat Barry's wife, Pat said to me two things in closing. She said, I think Barry's greatest talent was in creating smaller, personal and great interrelated spaces. He was dedicated to both his family and his profession, but the irony was not lost on Pat when she said that perhaps the last thing he may have said to her was, please don't let them forget about the city plan. So I think on that note, we'll farewell the live stream people. Is that what you do? Yep. And we'll invite a conversation.
Farewell, Jane McNeill.
And farewell, Jane McNeill. Yes, we had hoped you could talk, but yes, that didn't work out. So farewell, Jane McNeill, and we'll now have a conversation which I'm going to invite Dave Travalia to share a memory.
To share.
Yeah.
We do it in the round?
Yeah.
Yeah.